Hi, guys. Welcome to another Monday night study. We've been going through Daniel and looking at prophecy and connecting it to the Dead Sea Scrolls, things like that, church fathers. And what I've been trying to do is go through, and I'm going to put this together eventually in book form. And we're going through these empires. This week, I discovered something. It has to be significant. I'm not really sure what, but it's just really interesting to see patterns. I'm not much on numerology or anything like that, but when you do see patterns, it's pretty interesting. So let's start off by looking at some of our charts and just kind of recap what we've been doing. So basically, we have from the Testament of Noah, which is a Dead Sea Scroll, Noah has this dream. Now, it is supposed to be the dream that he had that we see in Genesis, where he goes to sleep, he wakes up, realizes what Ham did, and curses Canaan. And we're always wondering, what did Canaan do? If he's what did one person do one thing and why did you curse the other? And there's lots of theories and stuff like that. But according to Noah's testament, and this should have been written by Noah, he had a prophetic dream, and the dream is in two parts. The second part is specifically what two sons of Ham will do, causing a rebellion and an empire to form, which we know in Scripture to be Nimrod and his empire. So we're going to look at that tonight, specifically some certain points to it. But first, the first part of the dream is he has this general overview, much like in Daniel. And let me just hop there real quick. In Daniel, the book of Daniel has this overview, and it's these empires: head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, feet and toes of clay. And these are empires from his time forward, ones that are going to have something to do with Israel. And eventually the Messiah will come and set up a kingdom. We call that the millennial reign. Well, he mentions that the head of gold is the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar, the Persian Empire under Cyrus, the Grecian Empire under Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire under the Caesars, and then eventually the clay mixed with iron empire, which hasn't formed yet. And so it's interesting to look at this because Babylon falls to the Persians fall to the Greeks fall to the Romans, and so the Roman Empire should fall to the clay empire. But we don't really see that, and we'll get to that and see. It's just because we're not looking at the numbers right. We've talked about it a little bit before, but there's a Medo-Persian Empire, two arms, and then Rome starts out as one empire, pagan. Then later on, it becomes Christian about 380. 395, it actually splits into two kingdoms. There's the East and the West. So Rome proper and then Byzantine or Byzantium. So the two legs, and then the toes come out of that. But what's interesting is we're looking at parallels like 2 and 2, and then we're realizing that the head of gold has two phases to it. And the Greek part that we're seeing, once we got to the next chapter, is let me find it here. Greece, there we go. And this one. So in chapter 8 of Daniel, he sees Greece, which is a goat, attacking Persia, which is a ram. It has this one massive horn, which is Alexander the Great. As soon as it controls the known world, the Persian Empire is gone. Then this horn breaks off and fragments into these four. And we've talked about that before, how that means that the empire fragmented into four pieces. And that turned out to be Greece proper, Turkey, Syria, and Egypt, all under Greek rule. That's part of Greece, but they're actually separate kingdoms. And in chapter 11, we have all this talk about the king of the north and the king of the south and the battles they do. We started looking at that last week, and we'll get back to it next week. But the important part is we see this gap, and in the end times, there's going to be a king of the north, a king of the south. And the guy that runs the king of the north is that little horn, which is the Antichrist. So we're being told one little piece of the clue where the Antichrist comes from, approximately, not anything direct, but like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, that kind of stuff. So what's interesting though is with this whole idea, then it's Greece, but it breaks into four pieces, but only two of the pieces have anything to do with Israel. So it's two again. And what we noticed was if we go back here to Daniel, so this looks like one empire. It starts as one empire, fragments into four, but there's two that we have to do with. This is one empire, fragments into two. This is a coalition of two empires, Medes and Persians. And this we find out later is actually not just Babylon, but it's the Assyrians and the Babylonians rather. And what happens is they're not even directly connected. They're two separate empires. But Assyria comes in and captures the 10 tribes. And then Assyria is taken over by the Babylonians. They continue to hold the captives. And they actually further go in and then take the two tribes. So it's kind of an extension, but there's two pieces, Assyria and Babylon. And what's interesting about this is if you go back just in the scriptures and you look up in Kings and Chronicles when they did what they did, the Assyrians came in and captured the 10 tribes in 3 successive waves. They came in first and captured 2 tribes, went back home, didn't do much, came back, captured 2 tribes, 2 or 3, something like that. I think the first wave was those on the other side of the Jordan. Second wave was those around Galilee. And third wave finally was everyone else. Well, when you look at Kings and Chronicles also, you see that Nebuchadnezzar came in 3 separate waves. And so he came in 607 BC and then came back in 597 BC and then came back and completely finished it in 587. 587 is when the temple was burned or destroyed. And then 70 years, as Jeremiah predicted, from 607 to 537 was that 70-year captivity. And the Persians, Cyrus came and freed the Jews. And we've talked about that a lot. But just to bring up this, so the head of gold is Assyria, Babylon. The chest and arms of silver are actually Medes and Persians. The Greeks are 4, but there's just 2 that has to do with Israel. So for all practical purposes, there's 2. And that's Syria and Egypt, but Greek run. And then Rome, which is one empire, but it fragments into 2. So we see this pattern really of 2, 2, 2, and 2. And you see that in Daniel's beasts. When we get to the beasts of Daniel, we have the winged lion with 2 parts, Assyria, Babylon. Much like the leopard has 4 parts, he has 4 heads and 4 wings. I just didn't put the wings on this picture. So the wings represent parts of the empire. So there's 4 that has to do with 2. This is lopsided, which is 2. And this ends up being 2 legs with 10 horns, which we see later. So we're going to get to the Roman Empire, which I think we're all really interested in seeing, but we need to see the patterns so that we can understand what we're actually looking at. So with that in mind, this is really interesting to me. And we're going to go back and look at the Empire of Nimrod. So let's look at this first. And we're going to read some text and look at it. But we tend to think, or at least I had always tended to think, that Nimrod came along and just kind of took over. He did it all by himself, and that was it. And it's like, well, he had to have an invasion force and probably political things or something, but we're not told much about that in Genesis. But he comes in, somehow he takes over, he becomes a tyrant, and then it's destroyed. Tower of Babel is what we normally think about. And this is a picture drawing from the 1800s by a famous artist, the Tower of Babel, and they're making it and then that breaks off. But what's interesting is when you plug in the histories from like Josephus and Jasher and other things, it's not different, it's just more information. And when you get more information, it tends to paint a slightly different picture. So in this case, we have the Tower of Babel. And I'd always thought, just because of the way you read Genesis, it's real quick. The first 6 chapters are pretty much everything, and we're done. Um, well, pre-flood anyway, but post-flood goes on up. But chapters up to chapter 14, has all that stuff. But the thing is, when you start looking at the numbers, that's when it gets really interesting. And just to remind you, we have our Bible Facts website. Oh, I typed it right. Okay, and this is us broadcasting, but we have a DSS calendar site. And on here, we have all the studies for this. This is the current timelines, but we have UNA studies. And basically, again, just to remind you, they broke up time. Human history time is supposed to be 7,000 years, 6,000 years of man's history and a kingdom age with Messiah ruling. And that's what they've always taught. And so they break these up into sets of 500 years apiece. So we have grouped it to where you've got this introduction, which is this page, and it explains how everything works. But there are 14 unas, or 14 500-year periods. That's 7,000 years. And what we've done in each one of these is to come along and add dates. So like if you click on one of these, you're going to have Seth dying, being born, just different things like that happen in that time period. And we've grouped it with, there's 10 jubilees in an Ona. A jubilee is 50 years. And in that 50-year time period, there are 7-year periods, 7 Shemitahs, or 49 years, and a jubilee year. And everything fits very, very well. We've got all this documentation, and we have a lot of the data left. So coming back to this, what's interesting about it is we look at these things, and according to Josephus, Jasher, and other manuscripts, the whole thing starts 40 years before Abraham was born. So in 1908 AM, and AM is the dating, one of the dating systems that they use, the scrolls use. So it's AM is from creation. So 1,908 years after creation, Nimrod was born. While Nimrod was a youth, there was some sort of a skirmish or battle, we don't know much about it, between the sons of Japheth and the sons of Ham. And this was out in the eastern part of Shem's territory. Now, Shem has the Middle East. Japheth is supposed to be north, like Europe and that kind of stuff. But Shem's is the middle part. It actually goes out to India and to China, and that's supposed to be all his. Ham is supposed to get Africa, everything's south of there. But somehow somebody came up and went around to the east. And this was part of the prophecy, the second part of the prophecy in Noah's testament, of these getting attacked on 2 fronts. Canaan coming in from the west, Nimrod coming in from the east, or what would be Canaan and Nimrod. They're not named directly, but somebody from Ham's line does this stuff. So anyway, what happens is there's this skirmish. The sons of Japheth get the upper hand, and the sons of Japheth imprison the Hamites that tried the invasion, that kind of thing. Well, when Nimrod gets old enough, approximately 40 years old, his 40th year is the same year Abraham was born. So it gets really interesting, but he decides he's going to make a counter force and go up and free his brothers, and then maybe continue the invasion. And so this is what he does. According to the old text, it was a small army that we would consider it small. It was a 500-man army. So seasoned warriors against normal people, but 500 men. You can think of 500 martial artists with weapons, and our whole town, it doesn't really do anything with weapons, and we're not big. So what Nimrod did, according to the text, is to go city state by city state, send someone in, capture the king's children. And basically, they would be made aware of the fact that if the king would do exactly what he's told, the kids would be well fed, well taken care of, no harm would come to them. If the king does not do what he is told, Nimrod would not kill his children, but he would torture them. and he begins to explain exactly what he will do to, your kids. So this is a tyrant, an amazingly evil person. A lot of other things in the histories that he did, and he turned the government into a tyranny, developed this pagan system of religion to replace the religion that Noah and Shem had talked about. And we know all that stuff. There's a lot of histories. The Georgians fought against um, Nimrod and his son under their founder, which was Hike. And there's a lot of really interesting histories that go along with that time period. But the thing we want to focus on, looking at the patterns, is interesting because so Nimrod then comes to power in that year, seizes control, begins to solidify the empire. Same year Abraham was born. So that's 1948 AM. He pulls it together. The Canaanites go with it. Everything kind of snowballs. It gets to be an antichrist system. He has his own false prophet, a lot of parallels in that. But the Lord finally has to step in, much like the Gog Magog invasion. Nobody's going to help Israel, so God has to step in and do it. And God did. And so God stepped in, and what he did was create what we refer to as the incident of the fall of the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel wasn't completed yet. Everybody was working on this project. And the Lord sent confusion among the people, and basically it broke up into what we would probably say is 70 ethnic groups, each with their own language. Some of them probably really similar, many quite a bit different. Well, this is going to basically destroy the entire empire. Okay. And that's pretty much what we think of, because that's kind of where Genesis ends. And then it picks up with Abraham and just kind of goes on. So Genesis is I don't want to say watered down, but it is a very brief overview of history. And if you think about it, from creation to Abraham, when Abraham was 52 years old, that's 2,000 years. 2,000 years of history, and we have about 6 pages. There was evil, there was a flood, it got better, there was Abraham, there was a Tower of Babel, it was destroyed, and then Isaac and Jacob, and then Israel came on the scene. And that's really what they're trying to do. Moses is trying to say, real briefly, here's history up to Israel, and now we're here. And so now here's the history of Jacob, Israel, and his 12 sons and the 12 tribes. And it gets very detailed after that. Well, what's interesting, and you see this in Genesis itself, what happens according to the scrolls then is you're going to, everybody's going to pull together amongst for protection and everything, whoever speaks the language that I speak. So there's a handful of people that haven't went crazy, so I would think, and we pull them together. So there's basically these 70 ethnic groups, and they kind of hang out together. And we all know what racism is, the idea that some race is weird, inferior to ours, and we make up all these bad names for them, and we don't want to hang around them. And if you're a racist, and no matter what culture you have, there will be some people that don't do racism at all, and others that do. So the point is here is that even if you were to pull the empire back together, you've got these 70 different ethnic groups. Some of those people in each of those groups are not going to like other people in other groups. So there's no way the empire can be like it was before, no matter what happens. It's just not going to be as tightly put together, in other words. So, but what we see here is that one of the first things that they decide to do is to create translation schools or language schools. And there's one record of a guy named, I think, Nigel, that was an Assyrian that came down and founded a school in Egypt. And the principal languages that he studied and taught were Latin for the Romans, um, Hebrew, and something else, Egyptian and something else. But you get people that can translate. Kings won't take any time to do it, but kings will hire or have people to do this for them. So this is what happens. This kind of pulls everybody back together, but not very tightly, because you've still got to translate things, and it's the weirdos that you you have to translate to, in a lot of people's minds. So it's never going to be that tight. But what we see is the empire reforms, and under Nimrod, he continues to hold on to it. It's just not anywhere nearly as powerful as it was. Abraham, of course, is supposed to rise up and take over. He's the direct descendant of Noah. Technically, he should be the king of the planet and go forward, just like it's always been. But you have these pagan nations that go do their own things. So in this case, what's interesting is it re-solidifies under four main kings. And we see this here in Genesis 14:1. I don't know if I have the 14 in here. Let me just leave that up and we'll go to eSword. I'll bring up my eSword and we'll look at it. But this is interesting. And if you look up the histories, or just like a lot of the commentaries for that, Genesis 14 is the battle where Abraham rescues Lot. So basically, Abraham tries to stay out of all this because Abraham, years before, has been told by God that I'm going to bless your seed. They're going to inherit this land. But first, they're going to spend years not in prison, but in slavery. And it's going to start with his seed. There's a 430-year prophecy, 430 years from Abraham to the Exodus. And the 30 years is between when Abraham got the prophecy and when Isaac was born. So the seed is the important part. So from the birth of Isaac to the Exodus is exactly 400 years, according to the text. But anyway, let's look at this. So let me put this over here, and we'll bump this up so we can read it easy, and just go to here. There we go. And so this is Genesis 14:1. It says, it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elastiar, Chedorlaomer, the king of Elam, and Tidal, the king of the nations, that these made war with Bera, the king of Sodom, Bersha, the king of Gomorrah, Shinab, the king of Admah, and then Zeboim and Bela and Zor. And so we understand this as the five cities of the plains, basically refer to them as Sodom, Gomorrah, and the other cities, rebel. So they're under the leadership or having to pay tribute to Chedorlaomer. And it's interesting. Now, think about this for a second. Chedorlaomer is the king of Elam. So we see this as after the fall of the Tower of Babel. They're broken up into three powerful kingdoms. Elam is the province of Elam and Persia come together to form Iran. So the coastline of Iran is Elam. So we know about the prophecy in Jeremiah 49 about Elam being destroyed by fire. And that hasn't happened yet. So that's something in the near future. It's interesting that area is where the Bashar nuclear plant is. Iran keeps threatening to destroy Israel, trying to develop nuclear weapons. So it's an interesting time to set up to very carefully study Jeremiah chapter 49 on that. But anyway, Chedorlaomer, according to the text, is basically a total tyrant nutcase. So he's apparently not submitting a whole lot to Amraphel, but basically he's going around and slaughtering whole towns, both towns of giants and towns of humans. So this is going on through this whole time. And Abraham tries to stay out of it. But when this incident happens, they capture some of the people and take tribute and that kind of stuff. And at this time, Lot, Abraham's nephew, is with them. That's the thing you can't ignore. You attack my family, I have to get involved. And so I don't know if there was any type of negotiations or whatever, but Abraham decided it's time to move. So he and his 318 armed men, with other sons of Arphaxad and Shelah, got together, made a force of probably about 500 or so. Anyway, went in and attacked and drove, or chased actually, the army of Chedorlaomer. So they destroy the army, and he kills Chedorlaomer. This is the execution of this madman. and then they bring everything back, and everything's fine for a while. And this, of course, is when Melchizedek comes and blesses Abraham, because finally the prophecies are being fulfilled. But what's interesting, I'll come right back to that. So Chedorlaomer is the king of Elam. Arioch is the king of Elastiar, and a lot of people think Elastiar is probably one of two places. There is an area of Elastiar in the area of Eden, so that'd be the Persian Gulf. There's also a Telesar, which might be, a different way of pronouncing it, that was in the area of Saudi Arabia, or that area. And of course, if it's on the outskirts of everything, it's possible this guy controlled everything from there to there on the outside, and the other nations were in. But a lot of people wonder who Amraphel was. So Amraphel is the king of Shinar. Shinar is the other name for Babylon. The old texts say that Amraphel is the new name for of Nimrod. And Amraphel can be translated, it's two or three Hebrew words put together, but it can be translated, he who causes his people to fall. Much like the Pharaoh of the Egypt, according to the text, was actually a midget. He was actually short, very vicious guy, the son of Pepi II, or Pepi the First. Anyway, one of them. End of the Old Kingdom. So they referred to him as Adachem Ahuz, which basically translates out to say shorty. Now, you don't say that to a king because he'll have you killed. But when they're a tyrant and you want to, I say affectionately, but non-affectionately, call this guy what he really is, he's a short little kid that needs to be put in his place. He hurts people, and he's just a really bad guy. Adolf Hitler is not a very nice guy. He's a piece of whatever, is, like what we would say. And so Amraphel, he who causes his people to fall, or scatters his people, is a reference to Nimrod. You wouldn't dare call him that. It's interesting to me to see this, though, that it becomes the name. Like Babel means can be translated gate of God, but it comes to mean confusion, and we use the word in English for babbling, babbling, not making any sense. So, but Amraphel is the king of Shinar. Now, some people have said, well, it can't be Nimrod because the Tower of Babel's over, he's probably dead, etc. So it's probably someone else. But the thing is, if you plug this in and you look at it, this is when Chedorlaomer dies, and these other things happen, and Abraham is blessed, and we know the dates on these things. So Abraham dies when he's 175 years old, and that same year is when Esau kills Nimrod. And the text talks about at the end, when Nimrod is finally dead, that's when all the nations go back to being independent. Everybody gets their sons and daughters back, and the family of Nimrod is enslaved. And so that ends everything, but it's 100 and some years after the end of the age, and it's the time when Abraham dies. So at this point, then Abraham is making war, everything's going on. So according to the dates, then Nimrod is still in control of Babylon, at least 1/4 of the empire, Shinar proper. So Amraphel definitely is Nimrod. So we have Nimrod, Arioch, Chedorlaomer, and Tidal that are the four main powers. So what's interesting, we'll come back to this, but we look at this. So here is the Tower of Babel. It's a solidified, it's the Empire of Lead, according to the prophecy of Noah's Testament. And Nimrod and Canaan, the two sides came together and formed an empire. Nobody could withstand it humanly, so God had to step in, break it up by sending confusion. And that's the languages, the fall of the Tower of Babel. But the enemy very quickly tries to undo what God did, never does a completely good job, but kind of limps back together and forms a fairly cohesive group. So now this one empire becomes 4 kingdoms, just like Alexander the Great is one empire and becomes 4 kingdoms. So very, very interesting. So with that in mind, understand the text that talks about Chedorlaomer going crazy and killing lots of people, finally taking Lot. Abraham steps in, beginning to fulfill his role. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then, the nation of Israel starts. But if he destroys Chedorlaomer's army and kills Chedorlaomer, just think about that for a minute. That means Abraham single-handedly, well, with his people, but Abraham destroyed 1/4 of the empire. And that's interesting. So that might make the other 3/4 come and attack you. But what also might happen is, everybody's under Nimrod's control because he'll kill my kids if I don't do what I'm told. So everybody hates this guy. And here's this little guy. You might look at him as a little guy, even if he's fairly powerful, he's no match for an empire. But somehow he destroys 1/4 of the empire, and the madman is gone. Well, the little madman, Chedorlaomer. So if that's the case, if he can do it, we can do it. It's that kind of an attitude. If he can break this, we can probably break this. I got to be careful. So we're not going to hunt for Abraham very hard, if you know what I mean. We're going to look like we're submissive, but there's got to be a way out of this. And the entire planet's thinking this. If you think about it, it's interesting because when the Antichrist takes over, the Antichrist is going to have a lot of wars and he overthrows many countries. Well, the only reason he would overthrow any country is because that country doesn't like him and will not submit to him. And so they begin to fight against him. Now, they all lose because he's demonically empowered. But a lot of people don't like the Antichrist. That's pretty interesting. A lot of people really hate Nimrod. And I would be right there with them if you're threatening my family like that. So this is interesting. So 1/4 of the population, and all sorts of things come to my mind, like in Revelation, it's divided into 4 pieces, and 1/4 of the population of the earth dies because of one of the plagues, or at least the people have control over 1/4 of the population to kill. Lots of interesting things. But now, this is interesting too, because these people are trying to, and there's a lot of stuff about Nimrod coming after Abraham, trying to destroy him. So you've got Shinar, which is Babylon. You've got Elam, which is by Persia or Iraq. So in a sense, this is a king of the north, and this is a king of the south. They're quite a bit west, or no, excuse me, quite a bit east, but still north and south. Now, these two guys, we're not sure exactly where they are. They may be just there because they were ordered to be there. They don't seem like they're much of a threat. And people ask, where title King of the Nations, it's the word Goyim, or Gentiles. And Galilee is called Galilee of the Gentiles. And there's a lot of Gentile cities there. And a lot of people think that this might have been an area around Galilee. And then, so you can identify these. But if 2 of these are not a problem, they don't care about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel, they have their own things to do, then these 2 are not a problem at all. So it boils down to one nation separated into 70 ethnic groups, and the enemy tries to pull it back together and somewhat successfully creates 4 groups, like the 4 Grecian groups. 2 of them are not really a problem. They're not really that evil as far as Israel's concerned. And you have a king of the north and a king of the south. So a lot of interesting parallels here. So let's just look at some of these verses. And let me see if I can get here. Okay, history of Nimrod and Canaan. So in Genesis 10, we're told that the sons of Ham were Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. So Cush becomes Ethiopia, Sudan, that area. Mitzrayim is the one that founds what we would call Egypt. And the first city, the capital city, was called Memphis. And then Put is Libya. In Canaan, we know what happens. He travels up the coast and invades Shem's territory. And that's where we get the land of Canaan before it was called the land of Israel. So Canaan begot Zidon, his firstborn son, and created a city up in what we call Lebanon, Zidon, Lebanon, and then later on created Tyre. And so that what goes on there. Let's see here. But this goes on. These are quotes from Jasher and other places that tell the interesting story. Now, everyone would have known, according to folklore, if you wanted to call it that, everybody's parents and grandparents, is that there was this flood. Noah's in control. He's really the king. You should obey him. Seth will probably, or Shem rather, will probably be the next, king or whatever. And there's one God, and he destroyed the planet because of evil. But people are beginning to say, yeah, we don't really believe that. We believe the other line. And the people that this evil God destroyed, the Nephilim, sure seem to be nice. They talk about making us gods and stuff according to the text. And they fall into this type of ancestor worship, idolatry type thing. And it mentions that Nimrod did this. But there was a prophecy about Abraham. And at one point, Nimrod has a dream that he sees Abraham and at a distance, and Abraham holds out his hand, and in his hand is an egg. And he's focusing on this egg. It's almost like he's trying to give him an egg, but this egg, he's looking at it. The egg all of a sudden cracks and hatches, and out flies a bird, a small bird. But this bird flies right straight at Nimrod and winds up poking him in the eye. Well, that is weird, and he wakes up, of course, and it's a very scary dream. And so it's interpreted that the dream means a descendant of Abraham will kill you. So the magicians, it's like, we recommend you kill Abraham before he has any kids. And from that, it's like, yeah, that sounds an awful lot like the Bethlehem slaughter. If we slaughter all the babies, none of them will grow up to be the Messiah. And it always seems logical, just kill everybody. But if it's prophesied, it's not going to happen. If Nimrod would have submitted to the Lord, he wouldn't have got killed by a descendant of Abraham. But anyway, and of course, that takes on, it ends up being Esau that kills Abraham. And so we have that down here. Let's see here. That's the fall of the Tower of Babel. And let's see. Okay, anyway, it's in Jasher, but here we go. 27. This is the ending part. We'll just look at this part. It says that Esau, let me run this up just so you can see it easier. Here we go. That's a little better. Okay. So Esau at that time, after the death of Abraham, and this is real quick. In other words, it's that same year. Abraham had died and was buried, and the week of mourning had went by. But he frequently went into the field to hunt. Now Nimrod, king of Babel, whose name at that point was Amraphel, also frequently went with his mighty men into the field to hunt and to walk about with his wise men, or with his mighty men rather, in the cool of the day. So Nimrod was observing Esau all the days, for a jealousy was formed in the heart of Nimrod against Esau all of his days. So in other words, there's this legend that Esau is the best hunter that has ever been born. There's another legend that says Nimrod is the best hunter that has ever been born. So people were saying this. I'm not saying one or two is the case. Genesis says that Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. So he was at least one of the best, if not the best. Later on, Esau is born. Esau is giving him a run for his money. Now, this is interesting. At this point, again, we go back at the dates. Abraham has just died at 175, which means Esau is 215 years old. Esau is one of the first a son of one of the first four generations, and those people tended to live to be about 400 years. When you look at the lifespans, pre-flood is 700 to 900 years. Post-flood is, for the first 4 generations, is about 400 years. Something happened in the 4th generation that caused the lifespans to be cut in half again. So we're going from 900-ish to 400-ish to 200-ish. And that's about the best you can do. And you can see this. Abraham was 175. Moses and Jacob and the guys were 120 to 130, something like that. Joseph died at 110. And so it just kind of goes down. If you're very careful and are healthy and have good genetics, eat good food, have good medicine, it is possible for you to live to be over 100 still. So it's not likely, but it's possible. So that's what's going on here. So, but it's interesting. So Nimrod's 215. Esau would have been 15 years old. Now, Esau and Jacob were twins, so they're both 15. It's not hard if you have a really good bow and arrow and practice all the time to be a good hunter. You don't need to be a guy that can bench press 300 pounds. A 15-year-old kid can do that. And today, a good caliber weapon, you can go out hunting. You don't want to do it with a 22, but I mean, a good caliber rifle, and you find a deer and you pull a trigger and you're done. Now you got to go field dress it and everything. So you do need some help and some strength, but the accuracy. So to have a bow and arrow, long bow of some sort, and to be able to be very accurate at what you're aiming at is not that hard. A 15-year-old can do that. I think it's interesting because today we have people graduate from high school at 18. Sometimes they can't even read one language anyway. Not anciently, but like at the beginning, 200 years ago, the common practice was to graduate from high school at 16 and to go into college. You can't go into college unless you can parse Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and English perfectly, all the verb tenses and everything. That's a prerequisite for even starting college. And all these 16-year-olds did this. Kids at 12 had to know weapons because there's wolves running around. We don't have wolves like that around here, but it happens. And so you've got to be able to take care of your family. So totally different time period, but we tend to think of our kids as kids. And when they get to puberty, they're not really kids anymore. The only real difference, if they're trained right, is that they can't bench press 300 pounds yet. That's going to be 18 to 20. But anyway, just saying that, it's just we need to be very serious on making sure our kids understand the ways of the Lord. So there's this jealousy between Nimrod and Esau. On a certain day, Esau went into the field to hunt, and he found Nimrod walking in the wilderness with 2 of his men. All of his mighty men and his people were with him in the wilderness, but they had moved a great distance from him. So they're hunting something. They probably shot something. They're not sure where it skirted to, so they fanned out to try to find this deer or whatever it is that they're doing. So they're scanning out. So Nimrod is there with just 2 of his mighty men. And they don't know that Esau is close by, so he has the element of surprise. So it goes on and says they went different directions because of the hunt. Esau concealed himself for Nimrod and lurked for him in the wilderness. So kept hidden. Nimrod and his men were with him and did not know that he was there, of course. Nimrod and his men frequently walked about in the field in the cool of the day, and to know where his men were hunting in the field. Nimrod, with 2 of his men, were there, came to the place where they were, and Esau started suddenly from where he was lurking in that one place, drew his sword, hastened and ran to Nimrod and cut off his head. The rest of this story is that it was basically like an ambush. So first strike's easy. You just jump in there, whack, the head's gone. But now you got 2 guys. The 2 guys almost kill Esau. This makes sense. You got 2 Marines basically, and Esau. Now he might be able to turn, get a scratch, shish kebab one of them with the sword. The last guy almost takes him out, but he manages to do this. And then the other people come, and of course Esau takes off. Same thing again. You would think If a 15-year-old kid killed the president of a country, the whole country would hunt him down. Normally that's the case, but the tyrant is finally dead. What's much more important is that I get my kids back in one place. Who cares about an Esau? So Esau was never touched with us, but this is the actual fall of the kingdom. And again, when Abraham died, so it's not, so Amraphel definitely is Nimrod. And of course, it says that there in the text. And here's how the story ends. When Nimrod, the son of Cush, died, his men lifted him up and brought him to in consternation, buried him in his city. I'm not sure what his city was, wherever he's from, maybe somewhere in Sudan. All the days of Nimrod that he lived were 215 years, and he died. The days of Nimrod that he reigned over the people of the land were 185 years. So from the time he was 40 forward. Nimrod died by the sword of Esau in shame and contempt. And the seed of Abraham caused his death as prophesied in the dream. At the death of Nimrod, the kingdom became divided into many divisions, and all those parts that Nimrod had reigned over were restored to their respective kings of the land. So they got their kids back, took back authority, and I'm sure made sure that that's not going to happen again. All of those who recovered them after the death of Nimrod, and all the people of the house of Nimrod were for a long time enslaved to those other kings of the land. So the Antichrist system is destroyed, the tyrant is dead, things go back to normal, and at this point, Abraham had just died, so it's just a few years later that Jacob will have his 12 sons, and the nation of Israel will start. And then we'll eventually hop over to the Exodus from Egypt. One last point in here that I had, I put it at the conclusion here. Okay, maybe not. Okay, anyway, it was interesting. I think it was 300. I should have had that in here somewhere. Okay, anyway, point is it was 300 and some years between the destruction of the kingdoms, the Babylonian kingdom and the other. So going back to here, again, we'll come back to this. So here's Noah's empires again. So Noah sees these empires. So we know Nimrod's empire breaks up and is one empire, breaks up into four, two of which are a king of the north and a king of the south. This Egyptian empire, we'll see that some other time, forms by Pharaoh, which is not Pharaoh, excuse me, it's a king of Egypt, Mitzrayim, son of Ham, creates the first dynasty. And what we find out later, that an Assyrian comes down and ends up creating a power south of there, headquartered in Elephantine, and creates the second dynasty. And they end up ruling consecutively. There's always two dynasties ruling at the same time. And there's 792 years between the flood and the Exodus from Egypt. So the entire old kingdom of Egypt fits in that 792 year time period. And what's interesting is Canaan is the guy's name, the Assyrian that came down that founded the first dynasty. And he's the one that coined the term Pharaoh. Pharaoh means Lord of the Dead. And it's not a spooky thing like we normally think of. It literally means he who can cause the dead to pay taxes. What he did is they had a special, I don't know, something to do with their native religion or whatever, that people had to be buried in a special place. Well, he confiscated this area and put guards around it so that no one could bury their people in that sacred space, unless, of course, they paid him a fee. Then they could bury their dead. So, in a sense, he's causing the dead people to pay taxes or fees to him. So, hence the name Pharaoh. And that stuck, the Lord of the Dead. So, from that time forward, the kings of both Upper and Lower Egypt were called Pharaoh. Interesting story how this stuff gets started. But I want you to see this. So you've got a king of the north and a king of the south in Nimrod's empire, Amraphel and Chedorlaomer. And we see that from Genesis. And in here, you've got Upper and Lower Egypt, a king of the north and a king of the south. And then when we get to gold, that's going to be Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, but it's actually Assyria, Babylon. Silver is Medes and Persians. Copper is the one kingdom, Alexander the Great, broken into four, much like Babylon back here. But two of them, again, have nothing to do with Israel. So it's really two, Syria and Egypt. So it's a king of the north and king of the south. Same patterns. We get to iron, and it's one pagan system, pagan Rome. And it's actually after Israel even ceases to exist, 100 or so years later, that Rome splits into two, this time an east and a west, but two empires. Very, very important. And then we end up having clay or iron and clay mixed, which is what Daniel sees. And then this mysterious lead empire that no one else sees, we come to find out is Mystery Babylon. And it's not the same as these empires. It's an empire, but it's not its own right. It's more of a mystery religious thing that forms. So, and again, this is what he sees. And going back to Daniel, it's the same thing. Daniel starts in the time of the gold, and Assyria was already gone. So Babylon, or specifically Nebuchadnezzar, is the head of this kingdom, which is the head of gold. And then Persia, Greece, Rome. So we'll get back to this. It's going to be fascinating to look careful at all the history of the Roman Empire and how it comes up to our time period. So that's where we'll stop for tonight. So God bless you guys, and we'll see you next Monday.